Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is sponsoring tonight's lecture. Thanks, as always, to the generosity of our donors, past and present. And hopefully you saw I pasted a little message in the chat a moment ago directing you to our website. And even if you did not get a chance to check it out just now while you were waiting for us to begin, I encourage you to take a look, civilwar.vt.edu, nice and easy to remember. You can also find us on social media, and those are great ways to learn about what we're up to and find out what we've got coming up over the next few months. And I want to just highlight tonight one thing that's coming up. It's our big annual event, the Civil War Weekend, which takes place the last weekend of every March here in Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech. So the dates for next year are March 27 through 29, 2026. And we just posted the schedule on our website, so you can check out all the details there. We'll be opening registration in the next week or two. And the theme for next year is Civil War innovations. So we've got speakers exploring various transformations in American life, everything from naval technology to photography to foodways, lots of other stuff as well. And we've got a very special guest, Kurt Fields. Dr. Fields, you may have heard of, he's the renowned US Grant impersonator. So he's going to be speaking to us as General Grant about some of the military changes that took place during the Civil War. So that's our Civil War weekend. And just in case if a whole weekend of all things Civil War is still not enough for you, and I know there are lots of you out there who fall into that category, you can also join us immediately after the weekend for a field trip. We're going to the South Carolina Low Country. We're going to explore Charleston and Beaufort, lots of the historic sites. We're going to eat some great food, see some great scenery, and most of all, learn about how the Civil War transpired in the Low Country of South Carolina. So again, check that out on the website, and within a week or two, you'll be able to register also via our website. On to tonight's speaker now. I'm very pleased to introduce Lindsay Rae Smith Privette, who's an associate professor of history at Anderson University, which is in Anderson, South Carolina. And Dr. Privette was born and raised in Vicksburg, which will become very significant once you hear what she's talking about. And she actually developed her interest in Civil War history at Vicksburg National Military Park, where she later went on to work as well. She received her BA in history from Baylor University and then her MA and PhD both from the University of Alabama. And she's just published her first book exactly a month ago today. It came out. So it's still very new, still very exciting. And you know the title because this is the webinar you signed up for, The Surgeon's Battle, How Medicine Won the Vicksburg Campaign and Changed the Civil War. So that's what she's going to speak about with us tonight. And after her presentation, we're going to have time for discussion with the audience. And just to let you know, that will happen through the Q&A box in Zoom. So we invite you at any time just to click on the Q&A box and type your question in. You can actually do it now, although maybe hold off just in case she answers your question as part of her presentation. But really, anytime a question pops up in your mind, feel free to type it into the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. So thanks again to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight, and a very special welcome to Dr. Privette. Over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, everyone who is spending their Thursday afternoon or Thursday evening with us. Before I want to get started, I especially want to thank you, Paul and Rachel, everyone at the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies who kind of really helped organize this event. I'm excited to get to talk about my book for the next hour or so. So with that said, let me actually share my screen here and give you something interesting to look at. I think that should be my my PowerPoint slide. Does that look good? Perfect. Excellent. All right. With that said, let's get started. So as many first books do, The surgeon's battle grew out of my dissertation. About a year or so before I started work on my prospectus, I began brainstorming potential topics, and it was actually my advisor at Alabama, it was George Rabel, that suggested the idea of combining my two main interests. So I had started graduate school really fascinated with medical care during the Civil War. And part of that fascination had to do with how much I think we still have left to explore in this particular area. So after nearly 160 years, we've come to understand a lot of the struggles that are faced by Civil War surgeons and the havoc that infection and disease made on soldiers' bodies. Within the past 30 years, a lot of work has been done on the evolution of the United States Medical Department and its relationship to medical reform. And scholars have actually highlighted in this process that resource management, for example, is really one of the medical department's greatest contributions to the war effort. Between 1861 and 1865, the U.S. Medical Corps became rather adept at the rapid collection, triage, treatment, and evacuation of massive numbers of casualties. And then, in addition to this, they use the data that they collect on their patients to really deepen their understanding of the human body and advance their practical training. But I think there is a lot more to be said about how surgeons are affected by their work on the battlefield and how their responsibilities shape the relationships they forged with their soldiers turned patients. Now, on the other hand, I also had a very deep interest in the Battle of Vicksburg, as has already been highlighted. And this one's a little more self-serving, right? I'm a native of Vicksburg, Mississippi. I was born and raised there. Vicksburg National Military Park played a huge role in my formation as a scholar. And so much so that I spent several years working as a seasonal ranger, which all of that goes to say is that I knew the campaign and the siege very well, even before beginning this project. Vicksburg is perhaps one of the most well-known of the Civil War battles. It's generated its own spate of studies that examine everything from the quality of leadership to the Army's use of foraging, their siege tactics, engineering, and really historians who are becoming more interested in studying the environment's role in shaping the Civil War have also begun to include Vicksburg in their studies. And these studies have explored everything from weather and climate to terrain, even food production. So the surgeon's battle really sits at the intersection between these two fields. And in doing so, it tells a new kind of story. In terms of the scholarship of Civil War medicine, it shifts our focus from the Eastern Theater, general hospitals, from Washington, D.C., to battlefields in the Western Theater. And this allows us to explore the ways in which surgeons in the U.S. Medical Corps face very unique challenges when it comes to adapting to the terrain, the climate, even the isolation that is really characteristic of the lower Mississippi River Valley. Now, for those who are interested in military history or environmental history, the surgeon's battle also helps us rethink the importance of the campaign and siege of Vicksburg. The fall of Vicksburg has long been regarded as one of the key turning points in the Union war effort, but the surgeon's battle also demonstrates that Vicksburg played a significant role in the evolution of soldiers' health care. So, for those of you who might need a little bit of a refresher, let's start with Vicksburg itself. Vicksburg, Mississippi sits on the east bank of the Mississippi River, and I think you can see my mouse. So Vicksburg right here on the east bank of the Mississippi River. And really, Vicksburg towers, if you will, above the river. It sits on these huge bluffs that at times peak about 200 feet over the river. So by the time we get to the summer of 1862, Vicksburg is really the last Confederate stronghold on the river. Memphis has fallen into Union hands in June of that year, and New Orleans to the south has been under Union control since May. So the problem with Vicksburg, though, is the bluffs. They make the city almost impervious to assault. Union gunboats on the river really struggle to raise their guns high enough to really do sufficient damage to the Confederate river batteries. And try as they might, the Union Navy just cannot take the city from the river. So by the time we get to the summer of 1862, Vicksburg has become known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Cut about 6 months later to December of 1862, the Union Army is going to try to take Vicksburg once again, this time under the command of Major General Ulysses S. Grant. Right. So the very first attempt is going to take place in December, and it's actually going to be an assault from the north side of the city, up here where you see Chickasaw Bayou. It's a complete failure, does not work. So Grant goes back to the drawing board. And between January and April, his troops are camped out on the west bank of the Mississippi River, working on a couple of places, but this place in particular known as DeSoto Point that kind of juts out around the river. They're working on cutting this diversion canal, which is listed on this map as Grant's Canal. And the idea was to actually try to divert the river away from Vicksburg and kind of solve the problem this way. That also fails. So finally, on March 31st, Grant's men leave their camp in Louisiana, up near Milliken's Bend, and they start a march directly to the south. They move toward New Carthage, they cross the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg, and they will actually skirmish with some Confederates just south of Vicksburg at the little town of Fort Gibson. Repelling the Confederates from there, they'll move northeast toward Jackson, nullify the Confederate presence in the state capital, and then force the Confederate retreat back into Vicksburg, ultimately laying siege to the city for 47 days until the city is surrendered on July 4th. So, placed into this context, it's really clear that the Union victory has less to do with defeating the actual Confederate army than it does navigating the logistical challenges of waging war in the lower Mississippi River Valley. In fact, the Surgeon's Battle suggests that Grant's army is not simply engaged with one battle, but it actually has to navigate 3 separate conflicts. And the central challenge to all of this is the management of soldiers' health and their medical care. So the first of these conflicts is rooted in the tension between medical providers and their patients. This tension actually predates the Civil War as well. So in the early decades of the 19th century are a maelstrom of different theories, treatments, philosophies with regard to how medicine should be practiced and who should practice it. By the first quarter of the 19th century, most states have eliminated medical licensing law and the recognition of local medical societies. And this means that physicians' authority to practice medicine is largely dependent on their medical degree, the value of which has eroded because of proprietary policies, poor regulation, lack of practical training. So as a result, there's actually several unorthodox medical sects that flourish in the antebellum years, and they offer a lot of different alternative options for patient care. Now, of course, there's pre-war efforts to reform the medical profession, but ultimately, this means that the Civil War initiates a transition in which responsibility for soldiers' health and medical care is transferred from the domestic domain of the family and the individual to a very impersonal hospital system of the Army. And this exacerbates popular anxiety about medical care and consent. And soldiers resisted the loss of bodily autonomy in this process. Now, with its professional authority already tenuous, the U.S. Medical Corps' competence is further compromised by a near endless string of embarrassing failures during that very first year of the war. For the most part, Civil War surgeons were not members of the regular Army, but they were volunteers who had practiced prior to the war as civilian physicians. Now, the catch is that the responsibilities of a civilian practitioner are dramatically different from that of a military surgeon. And because they have little formal training, medical officers face a very steep learning curve. This includes knowledge about camp sanitation, medical treatment, and combat surgery, but it's also going to extend to their ability to regulate the emotional toll that's caused by the sights and the sounds of the field hospital. So, shortly after the Battle of Manassas in July of 1861, for example, Dr. A.B. Shipman, who is a contributor for the American Medical Times, wrote that, quote, "Not only are the surgeon's duties greatly increased, but they are rendered far more difficult than before." Indeed, he empathized with his colleagues who, quote, "on that day stood appalled at the magnitude of their duties and the utter inadequacy to the task." Like their medical officers, most Civil War soldiers were volunteers, having enlisted only to discover that the rigors of military discipline sharply contrasted with their ideas of personal liberty. And this generated tension between enlisted men and their commanding officers. But this tension also existed beyond that relationship into the interactions between soldiers and their surgeons. Just as soldiers chafed against the expectation that they would willingly submit to their commander's military authority, so too did they resist the expectation that they would blindly submit to their surgeon's medical authority. Consequently, soldiers' willingness to voice their frustration and criticize their medical officers not only challenged the professional expertise of the medical corps, but it did so publicly. Their letters, along with frontline reports, were circulated widely throughout the Northern press, generating outrage over condition of soldiers' health and the quality of their medical care. "Monstrous medical abuses," proclaimed one article in the Milwaukee Daily Sentinel. Quote, "There is a great lack of medical stores in the Army, whole brigades without an ounce of quinine." The article went on to describe the prevalence of unfit surgeons, quote, "Some drunk and others become hardened and indifferent to suffering." Reports such as these gave rise to the second obstacle that threatened to undermine the Army of the Tennessee's effort to take Vicksburg: civilian interference. Now, growing fears that military officials could not or would not safeguard soldiers' bodies led to increased involvement from Northern civilians, reformers, and other non-combatants. In some cases, these individuals acted as concerned citizens, writing missives to their congressional representatives on behalf of their loved ones. So after receiving a disturbing letter from his son working on Grant's diversion canal, which is the picture that you're looking at here, an artistic rendition of what that project looked like, James Wright of Des Moines, Iowa, wrote to Senator James Harland, pleading for help. Quote, "From every source we hear complaints of drunken soldiers and surgeons. Cannot our governors be allowed to take better care of our brave soldiers?" Wright asked Harlan to consult with the president and the secretary of war and, quote, "see if we can be allowed to save our beloved sons, brothers, and fathers from this fearful pestilence. In other instances, state governments attempted to intervene with resources earmarked exclusively for their soldiers. And this was the case at Shiloh. And state governments sent hospital steamers to aid the wounded. These boats, along with ones commissioned by the Army, clogged the waterways around Pittsburgh Landing, accepting overflow from field hospitals. But their presence added to the mayhem as scared and wounded soldiers flocked to the water's edge, desperate to board. Filled with men in varying states of physical and mental duress, these boats shuttled soldiers away from the battlefield and their command. After Shiloh, Sherman estimated that there were about 57,000 soldiers unaccounted for, and 4 months later, 2,000 were still missing. Quote, "I know well the intense desire to get home," he wrote to his brother that August, "but any army will be ruined by this cause alone." From his perspective, civilian-led evacuations subverted military authority and undermined the Army's ability to retain enough soldiers to fight the war. It was a dangerous precedent to set. Now, of particular note is the involvement of the United States Sanitary Commission and the Western Sanitary Commission. And I want to be really careful here because I don't want to suggest that there's no collaboration between the medical department and the sanitary commissions. There's actually quite a lot of overlap between the reforms that are supported by U.S. Surgeon General William Hammond and the United States Sanitary Commission. But when we shift our attention from the medical department to line officers, from Washington, D.C. to the battlefield, the relationship between the U.S. Army and the sanitary commissions become a little more complicated. The USSC and the WSC endeavored to provide the Army with ample supplies, manpower, and expertise in an effort to improve the quality of soldiers' health and medical care. Of course, none of the civilians involved in these efforts would have described their actions as interferences. And that is certainly not how they were interpreted by the rank and file. But for the high command and members of the field medical service, the sanitary commissions could easily become more hindrance than help. So, for example, upon hearing of the battle at Fort Donelson, John Strong Newberry, who is secretary of the Western Sanitary Commission, led a group of physicians and nurses to Tennessee. Their arrival flooded field hospitals with much needed supplies. But Newberry and the Army's medical director disagreed over who had the authority to distribute them. While Newberry's team anticipated the right to manage the resources themselves, the medical director disagreed. He requested that the commission turn over all hospital stores to the Army's purveyor, and that the physicians and nurses place themselves under the direction of a contract surgeon from Cincinnati. Newberry and his team found these conditions too objectionable, and having felt themselves greatly insulted, the commission members decided to turn over their stores and leave. Now, by offering competing medical services, such as evacuation, hospital care, even medical stores, civilian relief not only threatened officers' authority over their command, but also questioned the medical corps' ability to care for the sick and wounded. So as one early supporter of the USSC wrote, "The evils themselves were so glaring, the danger from them to the health and efficiency of the Army so imminent, and the government apparently so helpless to provide an adequate remedy, that it was determined by some enlightened men to try the experiment of infusing some of the popular enthusiasm and sympathy into the cumbrous machinery of government." This narrative, which focused on the medical department's failures and highlighted the USSC's humanitarian work, was instrumental to generating civilian support for sanitary reform. Commission agents leaned in, promoting their work as an opportunity for Americans to safeguard the lives and bodies of their sons, brothers, and husbands. Now, finally, the Army of the Tennessee's third major obstacle is the environment. The Mississippi River is a meandering river, which means that it has an extremely unstable channel that alters its path in accordance with silt deposits and erosion. And consequently, the region's topography serves as a testament to the river's ultimate power. There's cyclical flooding and retreating of the river waters, which carves features into the landscape that were often unseen, but nonetheless very serious obstacles for an invading army. Though bordered on by swamps and bayous to the north and the west, the city of Vicksburg itself is built on higher ground, and the floodplain's eastern boundary is marked by a line of bluffs. These specific bluffs that ground Vicksburg are part of the Lurse Hills, a unique sedimentary deposit that extends about 10 to 15 miles inland to the east and was responsible for the deep gullies and jagged ridges that made up the city's eastern border by 1863. And that is kind of the photograph that you have here. It's a little on the grainy side, but it's one of the best ones, I think. It gives you an idea of what kind of landscape Union soldiers were up against. When combined, these geographic features made Vicksburg strategically valuable, easy to defend, and difficult to conquer. But while they proved a strategic challenge for commanding officers attempting to take the city, they're also a medical challenge for surgeons. By the middle of the 19th century, the lower Mississippi River Valley had become notorious for its unhealthy environment. The region's subtropical climate, which is marked by temperate winters, hot summers, and a high humidity, facilitated the spread of mosquito-borne illnesses. The sixth season, which began in late summer, was marked by endemic malaria, sporadic outbreaks of yellow fever, to the extent that sickness, or in reality, the microorganisms that caused the sickness, dominated military operations in the region. Such disease was one of the reasons that the Union war effort to take the city in the summer of 1862 failed. Quote, "There is not a vessel in my squadron which is not rendered inefficient by sickness and vacancies," wrote Rear Admiral Charles Henry Davis that July. In the Benton, the number of sick and deficient is 1 in 4. In the Carondelet, it is 1 in 2. In the Louisville, it is 1 in 3. It seems to me that the only course now to be pursued is to yield to the climate and postpone any further action at Vicksburg until the fever season is over. And indeed, it's no mistake that the first time Grant tries to take Vicksburg is December, nor that his canal project ran through the winter and early spring of 1863. In fact, even when Grant decided to invade Mississippi, he launches that campaign in early May. And at that point, there's no reason to assume that that campaign would end with a 47-day siege. Instead, if the original plan had worked, Vicksburg would have been in Union hands as early as May 19th, with plenty of time to make arrangements before the sixth season even began. And just as Union officers were forced to accommodate increased sickness in those summer months, Confederate officers also came to rely on the sickness to defend the city. General Robert E. Lee, for example, was so convinced that the region's diseased climate would thwart Grant's campaign that he declined to send troops to reinforce the Vicksburg garrison. On May 10th, 1863, Lee wrote Confederate Secretary of War to explain that reinforcements, quote, "could not reach Pemberton until the last of this month. If anything is done in that quarter, it will be over by that time, as the climate in June will force the enemy to retire." Instead, Lee proposed an invasion into Pennsylvania. Now, of course, mosquitoes are not the only factor that threatens soldiers' health. Considering the blistering sun, the unforgiving heat, limited rainfall, incessant flies, it is clear that the natural world is just as important to Vicksburg's defenses as the Confederate batteries. And in this regard, the demands of practicing medicine in the Army of the Tennessee were shaped both by the Army's immediate environment and by its military objective. For medical officers, the campaign and siege for Vicksburg was a race to capture the city before the Army's overall stamina collapsed. Now, in order to successfully capture Vicksburg, the Army of the Tennessee had to navigate all three of these major obstacles. And to do so, each major conflict more or less has its own solution. So, for example, the first solution, the campaign demanded a level of flexibility that allowed soldiers to have greater control over their own self-care. Late on the evening of April 30th, soldiers in Major General John McClernand's 13th Army Corps began crossing the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg. By midnight, there were 22,000 men sitting on the east bank of the Mississippi River. They moved quickly through the night, carving a path from Bruinsburg toward Port Gibson, where they ran into Confederate forces from Vicksburg. And by the end of the day on May 1, the Confederates had retreated back to Vicksburg. McClernand's men had secured the east bank of the river, and the Army of the Tennessee was on its way to establishing a base of operations in Mississippi. But Grant did not want the Army to linger. He's anxious that Confederates would quickly strengthen their hold on Vicksburg. And he intended to march his men to Jackson, neutralize the state's capital before turning west. So all in all, the Army of the Tennessee would end up marching nearly 180 miles, and it needed to reach Vicksburg as quickly as possible. Now, Grant's corps commanders were worried that the plan was unrealistic. Both McClernand and Sherman believed that the Army would not have enough rations and that there was not enough infrastructure to supply soldiers with what they needed. Quote, I do not calculate upon the possibility of supplying the Army with full rations from Grand Gulf, Grant wrote to Sherman. I know it will be impossible without constructing additional roads. What I do expect, however, is to get up what rations of hard bread, coffee, and salt we can and make the country furnish the balance. Grant's decision to live off of the land changed his soldiers' relationship with their natural environment. No longer were they to simply move along the local flora and fauna, they were expected to thrive upon it. Just a few months prior, locals had planted their fields and gardens, and much of it was beginning to ripen. Fields were flush with livestock, smokehouses full of meat. Foraging orders were not a perfect solution to the Army's supply problems, nor were they intended to be. But they required soldiers to invest more effort into procuring food, made men more vulnerable to shortage, and sometimes required creative substitutions. Foraging orders, however, also gave soldiers greater control over their own diet and the authority to care for their own bodies. So in short, they regained some of the autonomy that they previously felt was stripped from them. Now, it's rather ironic that one of the characteristics that made the campaign so risky also becomes the Army's greatest asset, which is its isolation. After their victory at Port Gibson, the Army of the Tennessee advanced through the Mississippi countryside unopposed for 11 days. Their next encounter with Confederate forces would come on May 12th, when federal troops met a rebel detachment along the banks of 14 Mile Creek. This otherwise comes to be referred to as the Battle of Raymond. Between May 12th and May 22nd, the Army of the Tennessee would fight 6 major battles. And when you look at the casualty count, we're looking at about 8,064 Union soldiers would be killed or wounded that May. Nearly 90% of that number will fall in that 10-day span between May 12th and May 22nd. And it's the medical corps' responsibility to care for these men as quickly as possible. The medical corps' isolation at Vicksburg is really noteworthy when compared to other battles and campaigns during the war, because traditionally medical officers would rely on a network of roads, railroads, or rivers to help facilitate soldiers' removal from the battlefield. Surgeons work really quickly to treat everyone in their care and either return them to their command or facilitate their transfer to northern general hospitals. The goal is to consolidate and dismantle these field hospitals as quickly as possible. But at Vicksburg, this isn't possible. Instead, each battle during the campaign represented another dramatic drain on the Army's medical resources, not only because of the materials consumed during combat, but also because of the resources that were left behind. So fortunately, the medical officers in the Army of the Tennessee are up to this challenge, in part due to the Army's new medical director, Madison Mills. Mills had extensive military experience, and that experience was undoubtedly an asset as he arranged to streamline the medical corps' performance and eliminate administrative deficiencies. Consequently, medical officers in the Army of the Tennessee were more than abundantly supplied throughout the entire campaign, with few surgeons complaining of shortage. Now, while the Army's isolation created challenges for the Army of the Tennessee, its benefits outranked the detriments, particularly when it came to surgeons' abilities to retain authority over soldiers' bodies. Limited engagement with the rear meant that there was little opportunity for civilians to interact directly with those on the march. Few letters made their way outside of Mississippi and were posted upriver before the campaign was over. Those that did were not heavily circulated with enough time to generate public concern. The sanitary commissions were not there to scrutinize the medical corps' performance. Instead, the medical corps is really entirely left on its own resources, knowledge, and procedures to sustain soldiers through the campaign. So consequently, when Grant's men emerge along the outskirts of Vicksburg, they're hungry and they're exhausted and their hygiene has suffered, but they're in far better condition than anyone had expected. And this is the table that you're looking at the very bottom. So this is tracking disease in the Department of the Tennessee, and it's tracking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the top 5 ailments, most common complaints. February through March. So February and March are your 2 months that they're working on that diversion canal. April, they're beginning their march through Louisiana. And then May, we can think of as like that campaigning month. And what we'll notice is that, let me see if I can move this up here for a second. What we'll notice is that the overall number of cases across the board is slowly declining through these months. The only exception is dysentery, which is rising slightly. But overall, we see kind of an improvement within these particular complaints. So considering this, one member of the USSC admitted that there had been too much haste in judging the medical corps' dedication and skill. Quote, "It only remains for us to say that in view of all difficulties, necessary and otherwise, that the medical staff has accomplished all that can be reasonably expected of it. Acknowledging that the medical corps was capable of managing and restoring bodies of sick and wounded men transformed the Sanitary Commission's relationship with the Army of the Tennessee. When the Army reestablished contact with its supply base in Milliken's Bend, interaction with the Sanitary Commissions resumed. And for the rest of the siege, the USSC and the WSC supplied the Army with much needed resources. However, these actions were always supplementary and facilitated by the Army. The Sanitary Commissions did not directly interfere with soldiers' care and treatment as it had at Fort Donaldson. Now, the Army of the Tennessee's transition to siege tactics marks an important change in its approach to the Vicksburg problem. In their most basic form, siege operations reduced the need for federal troops to fight their way into Vicksburg. And while arrangements were still being made for a direct assault against Confederate lines in late June and early July, the siege worked to weaponize the local environment against the Confederate garrison trapped inside the city. Of course, Confederates were not the only ones to suffer amid the increasingly oppressive conditions. Nearly every soldier stationed around Vicksburg was susceptible to thirst, to hunger, to sunstroke, and exhaustion, all conditions that threatened to undermine not only their physical health, but also their mental stamina. And these factors were pervasive, intimately tied to the daily realities of siege life. However, Union soldiers had an advantage. They sought to mitigate their ordeal by employing the same informal self-care strategies that helped to sustain their bodies just as they had during the campaign. After all, soldiers' freedom to forage for food and comfort was a distinguishing feature of the campaign and was largely responsible for maintaining the Army's fighting strength. Now that the Army had reestablished its supply base, this self-care was less about meeting soldiers' physical needs than it was about alleviating the tedium of siege life. None of this could be said for the Confederates, though. As the siege progressed, sick and emaciated men poured from the trenches, quickly filling the hospitals. By the start of July, disease was ubiquitous throughout the Confederate Army. Nearly 1/3 of the garrison was hospitalized, and the remaining 2/3 were in questionable health. Realizing that his army was near the end of its endurance, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton sent a dispatch to his generals inquiring whether their soldiers were strong enough to fight their way out of the city. The answer was a resounding no. Quote, "The command suffers greatly from intermittent fever and is generally debilitated from the long exposure and inaction in the trenches," reported Brigadier General Seth Barton. Barton's assessment was echoed by Brigadier General Alfred Cumming, who reported that 50% of his troops were unfit for duty, and Alexander Reynolds, who reported that 2/3 of his men were so weak they would not make it 10 miles. Unable to fight, and with no relief in sight, Pemberton surrendered. On July 4th, 1863, the first federal troops entered the city of Vicksburg. Okay, I could always go on. This is a much longer discussion and project, but I am toward the end of my 35 minutes. And so I think that I'll pause there and give us an opportunity to talk and discuss and throw it to the Q&A session, if that works.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. The topic is so rich, so much to talk about. And to get started, we've got a question which I think is mostly about other personnel. So not the soldiers, not the surgeons, but maybe people in between, nurses, for example. Were there other categories of personnel like medics, this viewer is asking, who participated in taking care of the soldiers?
Yeah, so it depends on when and where we are during the siege. And when there's an opportunity for civilian personnel to come and participate. So when we look at the siege itself, and Grant has reestablished a connection with his supply base in Milliken's Bend, which is that northern section in Louisiana. We are beginning to have supply ships kind of come into Milliken's Bend, and they can bring more personnel in. And so that's where we'll see things like volunteer nurses from the USSC that will come, and civilian physicians who will kind of come and participate in that way. The Army itself has a different kind of ranking system of people with varying experiences and positions. that when we're in the midst of the campaign, you'll see them listed as surgeons or assistant surgeons, hospital stewards. Some of those men, the surgeons and assistant surgeons usually have medical degrees and they're practicing. Some of them are during battles performing different functions. Not all of them are operating the way that we would think of them all standing at an operating table. Some of them are organizing, they're taking data, they're doing all sorts of different things. And then sometimes we have some people who are listed as hospital stewards, for example, or wound dressers that don't actually have that medical background. And they will actually kind of go on and pursue a career in medicine because of those experiences after the war.
Wow, that's quite the range then. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. Thanks. We've got another question, this one about different leadership levels in the Army. Were different ranks given better medical treatment the higher up they were, or was it all roughly the same?
So in terms of medical treatment, one of the things that I do kind of notice, and I didn't necessarily have the opportunity to work into the book because of the constraints. I mentioned at the very beginning, like this tension between hospitals and being treated at home. And when we're looking at kind of battlefield treatments in the midst of the chaos, one of the things that kind of begins to emerge, especially in the city of Vicksburg, is that officers will, if they get sick or they get wounded, they'll actually be brought into private homes. And they won't necessarily, they'll kind of be separate from that huge general hospital function, or that huge field hospital function that we'll see. That's not necessarily a universal rule across the board, because in the midst of chaos, no matter who it is, you've got to get them to a place where they can receive the required medical treatment as quickly as possible. And if that's a field hospital with everybody else, that's where they're going to go and be treated.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question about a movie, The Horse Soldiers. This viewer is asking if you're familiar with The Horse Soldiers. This movie touches on conflict between the civilian and military duties of doctors. Did you see examples of this in your research?
I actually am not sure that I'm familiar with that movie. I'll have to go and do some more investigation and put it on my watch list.
Yeah, me too. I was thinking the same thing. I thought I'd seen most of the Civil War themed movies over the years, but I need to add that to my list as well. So thank you to the person who suggested that. Um, One attendee has more of a statement than a question. Greetings from Vicksburg. I thought you might be glad to hear that. And another person has got a question about water and how much of a problem it was when camps were not placed near good water. Basically, how important was water to soldiers' health?
Yeah, water's a huge issue. In the early stages, when if you're looking at all of that work around the canal, there's too much water. It's muddy and it's messy. They actually, and we're seeing a rise in a lot of ailments that indicate sanitary issues because you don't have a dry place to set up the latrines. And one of the more horrifying aspects of the canal is as they're working on it and dry land is such a commodity, more and more soldiers are dying. They start burying them in the levees, but the levees are also the only dry places where you can set camps. So as it floods, they're moving their camps on top of the graves of the men that they're burying. The whole thing just seems like just a nightmare. When we transition into the campaign, when they invade Mississippi, they have the opposite problem. There's not enough water. We hit a dry season, and there's not as much rain. There's not as much access to creeks and streams. So one of the things Union soldiers, the Union Army is actually doing is moving from water source to water source. They're fairly confident that if they hit a plantation, the water source on that plantation is safe to drink from. So that's one of the ways that they kind of navigate that. One of the reasons the Army ends up at 14 Mile Creek to encounter the Confederate forces is because they're there for the water.
Mm.
And then when we get to Vicksburg itself, water becomes a huge challenge. The river is the best source of the water. And the Union Army will actually barrel it and drive it behind enemy lines or to siege line or to the men in the trenches. One of the things they begin to notice is that if they go down to the river at the same time every day, the Confederates identify what time that is and they start waiting for them. And then inside the city, there's also struggles. The city of Vicksburg lasts off of cistern water, and that cistern water can make it through the summer, but it's designed to sustain 5,000 people. And there's actually a conversation in the city about expanding those resources to kind of accommodate in case anything were to happen. And the city doesn't do that. So that cistern system is still there to sustain 5,000 people when you have not only civilians, but then also all of the Confederates that are trying to pull from the same. And it collapses very, very quickly.
So how did they manage for water then? Did they have to go out to the river as well?
So some of them will go out to the river. And one of the challenges that you begin to see people talk about is especially downstream of all of the Army work. We're shelling into the city. Horses and cows and cattle are being killed.
Mm.
And one of the ways they're getting them out of the city is by throwing them into the river.
Wow.
And the Army will go through some of the houses and farms that exist kind of on the outskirts and take over the springs of the families that live there. They'll do some digging. So a handful of different kind of methods that they use to kind of keep themselves going, but they're in drastic circumstances. So water is almost as significant as food is by the time we hit July.
Yeah. We have a question that asks, were there any lessons passed to Grant from the Army of the Potomac in the East?
In terms of prior to?
I think in terms of healthcare and how to take care of soldiers, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So one of the things that it's in the book, I kind of sidestepped it for time issues, is one of the things that's really happening in the background of this is that in the East, we see a handful of medical reforms that come out. William Hammond is appointed Surgeon General in, I believe it's April of 1862. And he is really one of the first ones that kind of begins to rethink the management and the organization and to bring in some of these new processes. So he gets appointed in April. Jonathan Letterman is appointed medical director of the Army of the Potomac. I believe that's in June. And he's the one who famously sets up the ambulance system, the tiered hospital system, all of those processes. By the time we get to Chickasaw Bayou in December and the operations in Vicksburg, the Army of the Tennessee is actually utilizing a lot of that. The Union Army has not formally adopted that throughout, like made it mandatory to use all of those practices throughout the entirety of the Army, but it's becoming much more commonplace. So in the West, Vicksburg is really your first effort that's pulling and drawing from all of those reform efforts. And then figuring out what work, how the lower Mississippi River Valley is different from Virginia. So what works, what doesn't, how do you need to adapt and change those things?
Thank you. This one's a longer question. I'm just going to go ahead and read it out. I wanted to ask about a vignette that I think is in Grant's memoir. He told of a young enslaved man who was impressed to work on the Confederate entrenchments. He was blown into the air by a Union explosion and ended up in Grant's lines and was put to work for the Union. This seemed to me to be a great metaphor for Black labor in the war in general. I wondered if you could talk about African American medical treatment at Vicksburg.
Yeah, I want to say that his name was Abraham. That vignette, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a little while since I've thought of so many of those. Yeah, so my book, in focusing very kind of narrowly on the Army and the Army of the Tennessee, doesn't necessarily branch out into, for example, the battle at Milliken's Bend, which takes place in the midst of the siege, which allows to kind of incorporate a lot of those different voices and different experiences. After the city falls, Vicksburg more or less is going to become a refuge city. And they're going to be in the midst of more or less a public health crisis. The infrastructure of the city has been very much damaged and destroyed. Water's depleted. We've kind of talked about that. Food's a struggle. The Union Army is coming in and they have access to resources, but we're also going to have so many more civilians flood into the city. And that's going to include freed men and freed women. So there is a fantastic book that I'm blanking on the title of. I think it's Bradley Clampett's Occupied Vicksburg, that really does a fantastic job of looking at what the next several months of the city kind of look like as it's trying to navigate all of these different healthcare crises, which includes Confederate civilians, your Confederate soldiers who aren't well enough to evacuate out of the city, your Union soldiers, your freed men and women. They have a diverse array that they kind of have to navigate and deal with.
Yeah, what incredible scenes there must have been there after the surrender. Um, we have a question about kind of a big, long-standing question about the relative importance of Gettysburg versus Vicksburg in Civil War history. I'm sure you came across a bit of that when you were a park ranger at Vicksburg NMP. So how does this story affect your answer to that question? For example, this attendee is asking, was the siege of Vicksburg more of a consequential turning point in terms of Army medical history than Gettysburg was?
So I think what I'm beginning to see, and I think that this very much relates back to the question about the reforms in the Army of the Potomac and how they're moving from theater to theater and potentially moving back again. There's a book that came out in July, Barbara Franco's Gettysburg Surgeons, which I think does a terrific job of looking at medical care in Gettysburg. And they really draw, right, by the time we get to, with those reforms going into place through the summer and winter of 1862 in the Army of the Potomac, by the time we get to Gettysburg, they're becoming more and more practiced at really efficient medical care. And Gettysburg benefits from railroad lines, a proximity to Washington, D.C., and other big cities that have general hospitals. And those things are not necessarily true of Vicksburg. So one of the things that I think is really significant about Vicksburg is we not only are seeing the Army beginning to actively adapt itself to the medical needs, but it's coming up with innovative solutions to problems that you don't have at Gettysburg. And in many instances, when Grant makes his transition back to the East, right, and takes over the Army of the Potomac, Some of the lessons that he's learned, for example, the flexibility of soldiers to be able to care for themselves and how important that is, make their way back into the way he manages some of the campaigns toward the end of the war. And same goes for Sherman when he takes over the Army of the Tennessee. So you see kind of these transformative processes that move from east to west, change, and then move back to the east.
Yeah, that leads kind of nicely onto another question, which is more about the technology of medical changes. How
Mhm.
much did new technology at this time spur on medical changes, whether we're talking about the West or the East, I guess?
Yeah. So a lot of a lot of what's really spurring on the changes, I think, is the ability to transmit information and to decide what to do with that information.
Mm.
Um, the Chickasaw Bayou, for example, there's a report that gets written by a surgeon. And for the very first time in the war, because of how they've managed data collection, he's been able to take everyone who had surgery at Chickasaw Bayou and trace them 10, 20, 30, and 60 days out, and then figure out which amputations or which resections were successful, when those happened, those kinds of questions. We've had some really great books and studies that are coming out about the Army Medical Museum and the collating of all of that data and how that kind of gets transmitted. One of the things that I noticed with a lot of my surgeons at Vicksburg is what really began to make them unique is the lack of medical technology, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And it kind of goes back to that isolation theme. So I found the medical director, I think he's the medical director of McClernand's Corps, who actually writes about when they get into the countryside, they have really the medicines and the materials they've carried with them. And they have more and more casualties, right? And they have to figure out how to make these guys comfortable. They haven't brought tents and beds for everyone who's being wounded, needs surgery, and is being left behind. So they actually figure out how to go into the forest and harvest cane. And they start making sheds with cane that are covered, that keep the soldiers out of the rain. But then they actually go a step further and start using this cane to make individual beds for them. And then they figure out that the beds are strong enough that they can, especially for those who have received wounds to like their like broken legs or femurs, that they can actually hang weights off these beds and actually create a sense like a type of traction. So they're very much learning in the midst of how to adapt what they need with what they have.
Yeah, that's so interesting because when I think about Civil War medicine, some of the images that come to my mind are from the TV show Mercy Street. Did you ever see that?
I'm
Yeah.
familiar with it. I saw a few episodes yet.
Yeah, and so that one's set in Alexandria, and of course, a very different kind of environment than we're talking about here around Vicksburg and the whole campaign running towards Vicksburg. So yeah, it's obvious in a way, but I never thought about it before that things would look totally different and the kinds of supplies that were available were different. So people had to come up with their own solutions on the fly. Um, we have a question about hospitals. Were large buildings commandeered as hospitals during the siege? Like, for example, the churches of Frederick, Maryland, that were commandeered before Antietam.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, we're dealing with a much more rural environment. And one of the struggles in the Western Theater in the lower Mississippi River Valley is you don't have as many houses. You don't have as many. They'll definitely try to commandeer houses, especially when they fall uh, behind their lines. But in many instances, they're not the big houses or the big churches that you think of that can contain everybody. So, for example, Chickasaw Bayou, which is the assault that takes place in December, I think there's one plantation house. They do almost everything. If it's not in a field hospital where they've like set up a makeshift hospital, they're using hospital steamers and boats, which is really unique to the Western theater, because there's so many more rivers than these urban environments. When you get to Vicksburg and the siege of Vicksburg, that's definitely the case of Confederates. They have access to the inside of the city, so they can use churches. There is some military hospitals and city hospitals inside the city. They commandeer civilian houses. At one point, all of these places that have been set up for hospitals kind of run out of space. And so we start to see commanding officers complain that they sent men to the hospital and they've now been sent back to the trenches because there's no place for them to go. On the outside with the Union lines, many of them will flock toward farmlands, right? So they can use the houses, but these houses aren't big enough to just keep people inside. So they may use the interior for the worst cases for your operations. And then they'll find and set up pleasant places like in the garden or under the trees where people are kind of convalescing. And then a lot more of your bigger hospitals, once they start consolidating into core hospitals or tents, they're massive tent cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I've been wondering about your experience as a park ranger, um, and how much that influenced your decision to do this project and the way you did this project and the way you conceptualized health and soldiers' experiences. And I guess one way to answer ask that question is to say something like, do you think you could have written this book had you not had that experience as a park ranger?
I th- I think I could have. I think it would have been different. Um, there's a section, and I'll give you an example. There's a section at the beginning of chapter 5, I believe, where I kind of just stop, and so much of the book's tied into the environment. What does it feel like to be in this land? What does it look like? What is Vicksburg in May like? And so, I just kind of stop and try to like reconstruct how green everything is and how beautiful everything is and all of these things. But a lot of, I think my initial interest really came from wearing a very hot National Park Service uniform in Vicksburg in July, the weekend that the siege would have like ended, and like walking the battlefield and trying to think about these guys in these hot woolen uniforms running up and down these bluffs and these hills, and just how exhausting that would have been. And I think that really sparks the imagination of, we think so much about heat stroke and consuming enough water and the things you do to take care of your body when you're overheating. What would that have looked like in 1863? What of those things were common practices or not common practices? So I think I might have still come to it, but I think that experience definitely lent itself toward kind of more vibrant questions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I did get the feeling when I was reading the book that heat was actually a major character in the book. It's very vivid when you describe the heat they had to deal with and some of the measures they took to offset the heat, but it was never quite enough. So it makes sense that you were channeling your own experiences on those July days in those sections. Same with mosquitoes as well. I don't know how often you were bit by mosquitoes, but they seem to be really major characters in this story as well.
They do, and they're like the unseen players, the things that we don't necessarily think of when you're thinking of the environment, right? These little tiny buzzing creatures.
Yeah, but what an impact they must have had on those soldiers' experiences that summer.
Indeed.
Um, Well, we have just a few minutes left. I've got one more comment slash question that I'm going to end with. It's a fellow Civil War era history professor who says he's got many students interested in medical issues in the American Civil War. This book is already a staple in the sources I point them towards. Perhaps an unfair question since this book just came out, but what's the next project? Do you have something in mind or something that you're working towards?
Yes, yes. So I one of the things I became really captivated in, um, and I didn't spend a ton of time on it is in this talk, is the way in which surgeons are transformed from like that civilian practitioner into like a veteran military surgeon. And so that's from a professional standpoint, but I'm also kind of convinced that we haven't thought enough about them as personal individuals. So I'm really fascinated by what the emotional impact of their experiences were, both as they're kind of going through it, but also how that affects them as the war ends and they try to transition back into other professional roles, personal roles, and kind of try to cope with what they've seen after the war. So I think that that's kind of where the next one is going to kind of go.
Yeah, that sounds like a terrific project. Well, I will look forward to seeing where you get to with that, and hopefully in a few years' time we'll have you back on and you'll be talking about this next book.
That would be terrific.
Well, I want to. Time is at close now, so I want to thank everybody very much in the audience for the great questions they have asked tonight and participating in the discussion. I want to thank the donors to the center for making this and everything we do possible, and most of all, I want to thank Dr. Privette for sharing your expertise, for taking the time to be with us tonight, and for writing this terrific book. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Good night, everyone.